This is another edition of Cavanaugh's Corner, the labor talk show, here in Southern Maine on public access television. Today we're going to be at the University of Southern Maine at a forum hosted by the university called Why Women Work. It's the beginning of a three-part exposition at the university on the issue of women working in our society. And today's session will be keynoted by two very important women who are both labor activists, one a labor activist and one a labor historian. Dorothy Sue Cobble, who's an academic from, I believe, Rutgers University and a labor historian, and Kristine Rondeau, who is the organizer who headed the successful organizing drive of some 3,000 clerical and technical workers at Harvard University a few years ago. This is a really interesting opportunity to have these two women who have had so much to do with the active efforts of women workers here in our society to come to Maine and share their perspectives and thoughts on this important issue. So this is something that concerns our union in particular. We represent lots of women workers here in Maine and around the country, and we're very happy to be able to bring you today's symposium at the University of Southern Maine, Why Women Work. Please join me.
As we turn now to today's topic, Why Women Work, I'd like to welcome Professor Dorothy Sue Cobble and Ms. Kristine Rondeau to the University of Southern Maine. Would you join me in welcoming them?
Thank you, Susan, for that kind introduction. And I'm very honored to be part of this series, and I'm particularly honored to be speaking with Kris Rondeau. She's a woman whose work, which I think of as transforming work, I've admired for a long time. Can people hear me at the back? Okay, is there a problem? All right. I've entitled my talk today, Transforming Work, Visions of Equality and Leisure. And I know Susan said I'm going to talk about post-World War II women in work, but actually I'm going to go back into the 19th century as well. The title I've chosen reflects what I see as two goals of women reformers historically, a search for equality and also a search for time away from work, equality at work, but also time away from work. And the title's also prompted by the fact that I think those are goals that are really appropriate for today as well. I think perhaps I'll start by a small confession. I once directed a Center for Women in Work for 4 years at Rutgers, and I found myself fantasizing actually quite a bit, not that I directed the Center for Women in Work, but that I directed a Center for Women in Leisure. And part of that, I think, probably had to do with trying to raise 3 kids at the same time, kids I'm still trying to raise. And I think it's very important when we think about women in work and the differences between the experience of men at work and women at work. We're all familiar with the pay gap, and there's increasing research on what's called the promotions gap, the status gap, the authority gap, but I think one of the most important gaps is actually the leisure gap, so I don't want that one to get lost. Let me turn back the clock a bit and talk about two things. There's 2 broad topics that I want to try to cover in my half hour. I want to talk about the historical experiences of women in work, the dominant work patterns and work arrangements for women historically. I also want to talk about the reactions to these dominant work patterns from women reformers. So I'm going to talk about those 2 things. And let me begin by posing and attempting to answer a first question. how has the larger culture defined women's work? And one of the things I'm going to be arguing through this talk is that regardless of whether we're talking about the 1830s, the 1930s, or the 1990s, I think that the dominant notions of appropriate women's work have been constructed with two paramount concerns in mind. There's been a concern that women's wage work should not challenge the power relations or division of labor within the family, and I hope to show that historically. And the second concern is that women's work should not make the achievement of gender identity, particularly male identity, an impossible or problematic task. And there are really 5 different aspects of the way in which work and work arrangements have been constructed for women that I'm going to talk about. And the first has to do with where they worked. In the early phases of industrialization, for example, the need to preserve the authority relations within the family meant that the homework system or the outwork system, which was the work arrangement in which women stayed within the physical preserve of the home or near the home and manufactured items, such as cloth, yarn, or shoes for the market, that would be the dominant form of wage work for women initially. And I think Chris Stanzel, in her book, City of Women, argues that this system of homework or outwork flourished precisely because it ensured that women would not gain independence or autonomy through their wage work. And you can also see some of those same concerns operating with the early factory women or factory girls. There was the notion of having them live at home if possible, and certainly to send back their income to be part of the family economy. The concerns for preserving family structure affected not only where women worked, but which women worked. A brief stint at wage work for young single women might be acceptable, but wage work certainly should end upon marriage and motherhood. And you can see that only 5% of all married women worked in 1900, for example. What we are living through and our mothers and grandmothers lived through is an incredible revolution in terms of which women were thought to be acceptable as wage-earning women. It took quite a while for wives to be accepted. That was really not until the 1940s and 50s. And today we still have the debate about combining motherhood and wage work. But we know this typical woman worker in the 19th century and right into the 1920s, which was seen as a young, single, temporary worker, was not the only woman worker. And I think artist Cameron's book is quite wonderful in showing us the invisible, socially invisible women, not the typical women, but certainly the millions of single and self-supporting women, as well as the millions of wives and mothers for whom wage work was a lifetime proposition. Her book's also interesting in touching on one of the things that I think is a very fascinating response to wage-earning women in the progressive era, the end of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. What you have is an enormous increase of wage-earning women, moving from 15% of all women in 1880 to 25% of all women in 1920. And you also have an increase in what was seen as women who were economically self-supporting and were quite threatening to the culture at large. Young women living apart from their family, female heads of households, and single career women. And that really produced a crisis of sorts in the culture. It's captured in this notion of the woman question that had to be addressed. It was feared that if women found self-reliance and economic independence through wage work, that they would abandon their home duties. from child rearing to feeding and caring for their husbands. And in fact, fertility rates did fall in this period. And one of the most disturbing things for the culture at large was that marriage rates began to fall as well. This haunting specter of family disintegration was banished in part by defining women's work as work which would not provide a living wage. So that's the third aspect of women's work historically, that women would be paid a supplemental or dependence wage, not enough to support a single woman and hardly enough, or let alone a woman with children. This substandard wage for women was justified because all women would or should marry. And of course, it also ensured that marriage would remain the only economically viable choice for women. Men's work, on the other hand, it was thought should command a family wage, or a wage that would allow a man to support a wife and children at home. And I think Alice Kessler Harris's book, A Woman's Wage, is very convincing in arguing that this history of and the support for a family wage notion, that this legacy is still with us in terms of explaining the pay gap today. The fourth thing I want to turn to in terms of the way women's work was constructed historically is something we're very familiar with, and that is rigid sex segregation and the sex typing of jobs. Basically the notion that certain jobs or tasks are deemed appropriate for women and others for men, and woe to those who transgress these boundaries. At times, the sex typing of market work appears to be just a simple transfer into the marketplace of the pre-existing sexual division of labor in the home. So in the 19th century, for example, some 70% of wage-earning women were domestic servants, basically doing in another woman's household what was also expected of them in their own. You also have large numbers of women who are laundresses, seamstresses, textile workers, continuing the household traditions of needlework and cleaning. And then in the 20th century, what we see is women once again following their traditional home duties into the marketplace as the work of nurturance, caring, and feeding becomes labor that's done more frequently outside the home as much as it's done inside the home. It becomes less a private matter and more a commodity bought on the market. So the early 19th century service occupations that were common, typical of women, nursing and teaching, were joined in the 20th century by new service jobs such as waitressing or clerical work. Clerical work was a job that was described unabashedly, for example, as the office wife. But the sex typing of jobs historically, I don't think can be explained as merely an extension of women's domestic responsibilities. Clerical work was defined as men's work in one historical era, for example, but then quintessentially female in another. Birthing babies was women's work until the 20th century, when it was redefined as skilled, technical, well-paid, and male. And then, as the work of Ruth Milkman has shown, almost all industrial tasks were labeled either male or female, but these labels varied wildly from industry to industry or plant to plant. And her work is also wonderful in showing how the sexual division of labor, the line separating men and women's jobs, can shift, and so jobs can be redefined as female or redefined as male, but the separation itself remains despite World War II, despite economic transformation or technological change. So I think to be fully understood, the sexual division of labor and market work has to be seen as produced by multiple forces. Yes, it reflects gender roles in the family, but it's also an arrangement that is reproduced daily in the marketplace. And there's a wonderful new work, a lot of work by sociologists about this, the ways in which women as well as men reproduce this sexual division of labor. One of the great contradictions, of course, in the history of women's work is that many women labored in jobs from agricultural work to laying railroad track to prostitution that did not conform to what the larger culture deemed as women's or proper women's work. But this problem was resolved in part by simply considering the women in these jobs as not respectable or not true women. And Evelyn Glenn's work is helpful here. She argues that racial ethnic women historically, and these were the women who held most of what were seen as the unrespectable or non-traditional jobs, that they were seen really as workers, i.e. male, and not as women or potential mothers. And so one example of this is that what you see in the 20th century is a whole welter of laws passed protecting women at the workplace. But in almost every instance, and there are laws such as restrictions on hours, laws requiring rest breaks, minimum wages, safety standards. In almost every case, both at the federal level and the state level, the jobs that are historically dominated by minority women are excluded from this legislation. I think the other aspect of this is that the family wage that I talked about earlier was rarely a wage that was extended to minority men. The fifth and final aspect of the dominant construction of women's work that I just want to briefly mention is this notion of the devaluation and denial of female labor. Housework, for example, by the late 19th century, as Jean Boyden points out, was redefined as a form of leisure. It was seen as primarily play. It was done out of love, and hence it was not work. And you can see as well the invisibility of women's effort and skill in the marketplace. Waitresses, seamstresses, childcare workers, you name it. It was thought that they came by their technical skills and their interpersonal skills naturally. In other words, it was something that all women possessed. And one of the implications, or one of the consequences of this, is that since these skills associated with women's work were natural, then it wasn't necessary to provide training for women. And also, many of these skills, it was difficult to think about advancement. Let me just give you one example. The women that I studied, waitresses, for example, to the degree that their wages were correlated with appearance rather than any kind of skill, then as the women aged, instead of their incomes going up, their incomes went down. In the time I've got left, let me turn to the second part of my talk, and what I wanted to focus on is not so much the ways in which women's work was constructed by the larger culture and their experience historically, but the ways in which women reformers thought about how to change the nature of women's work and how to rearrange these dominant work arrangements. And there's a lot I could say here, and I'm just going to focus on the 20th century, really. And I'm going to focus on what I think of as two primary social movements, two waves of female reformers. The first wave from the turn of the century to the 1960s, what we could call social feminists, what other people have called maternalists, what I'm now calling labor feminists, at least in the post-war period. And then the second wave of equal rights feminism in the 60s and 70s. And then what I'll do is simply close my talk by making some suggestions about what I think should be at the heart of a third wave of feminism, a feminism for our own era. And I'm very interested to hear what other people think about what should really be the core of a new gender politics or a new feminism. Let me emphasize at the start that one of the things that interests me about the female reformers historically is that their critique of the work arrangements, their argument was not simply that it was important to open up men's jobs to women, as important as that was and still is, but rather just as often, many of these women challenged two other aspects of women's work. First, the need to value and recognize women's work, both in the home and in the marketplace, and hence then the notion that it should be fairly compensated, but also what I would call the politics of time. Not only how women's time should be divided between home and family, but whether women, like men, had the right to leisure time. And I think this notion is very aptly captured in a slogan from World War I, which was, quote, "one woman, one job," unquote. Basically challenging this notion that one woman should have both the burden of housework and wage work. So their idea was one woman, one job. Okay, let me speak briefly about this first wave, the social feminist wave. And this encompasses the work of middle-class social reformers from women in the Women's Trade Union League up through the Women's Bureau and some of the women that I'm currently writing about. Most of this group really thought that, especially up until World War II, that only if that the majority of women did not place primary emphasis on their careers. They saw the majority of women retaining a primary commitment to the home, but increasingly entering wage work, either out of necessity or out of desire. And it was these women and the difficulties that they were encountering that they were attempting to address. What did they advocate? They wanted women's wages to be raised to provide adequate support for their families. They felt that women needed greater control over their working hours so that they can ensure time for child care. They needed protections at the workplace, such as night work laws, health and safety standards, to preserve their bodies and their reproductive functions. The historic work of women did need upgrading and recognition, whether it occurred in the private or the public sphere. And Mary Anderson, for example, who was head of the Women's Bureau in the 1930s and 40s, turned her attention to what she called the vast field of women's endeavor, the female-dominated jobs, arguing that these jobs needed to be revalued and the wages raised. The slogan then was the notion of equal pay for work of comparable value. And eventually, we did have the Equal Pay Act in the 1960s, but the initial proposals that the social feminists put forward in the 30s and 40s were of a much broader kind of law that would have raised the wages not just for women who were doing jobs similar to men, but would have raised this question of reevaluating women's jobs and the skill and raising the wages in those jobs. This wing of feminism didn't focus primarily on integrating women into men's jobs or the upward mobility of individual women, and rather than challenge the sexual division of labor, they sought to raise the wages of women's jobs and to revalue women's sphere. But like the culture at large, and unlike the later feminists of the 60s and 70s, they also assumed that women would remain primarily responsible for the home. And rather than challenge that reality, they pushed for the restructuring of work so that women could fulfill their family commitments and not suffer unduly from their responsibilities as homemaker and wage earner. In some ways, you could sort of think of them as a separate but equal approach. The National Women's Party challenged this version of feminism beginning in the 20s, and as we know, by the 60s, many of the assumptions of the equal rights feminism, the second wave, emerged as dominant. Equal rights feminists argued that the achievement of equality with men necessitated the opening up of opportunities in the marketplace for women and the breakdown of the sexual division of labor, and that they were very different than the feminists before them. Equality would be gained through equal treatment, and they wanted to end the sex-based protective legislation that the earlier generation of women had so painstakingly constructed. And in part because many of these were single women, in part because of their ideology emphasized the similarities between men and women rather than the differences, and in part to protect the fragile legitimacy of the career woman in a period hostile to female achievement, I think the equal rights feminists downplayed the need to accommodate and address women's family responsibilities. So the problem of combining work and family where it existed, they thought would be simply faced in private and resolved through individual maneuverings and adjustments. Of course, this equal rights feminism never represented the views of all feminists in the 60s and 70s, and perhaps not even the majority. You can see that in Alice Eccles' account of radical feminism in this period, her book Daring to be Bad. And since the 70s, long-simmering criticisms of equal right feminism have resurfaced as various versions of a new gender politics have been articulated. So let me just close then. I simply want to suggest a few of the issues that I think should be at the heart of a new gender politics, one for our time. And I think that probably many of these will also resonate with Chris's remarks. I think we need a transformative, subversive vision of both work and family. I think we need to move beyond models that ask women to be like men and that assume that sameness of treatment will result in gender equality. I think we need to reject the romanticization of men's jobs and the automatic assumption that advancement means assuming the male work role. After all, why should women have to move into men's jobs in order to enjoy status and a decent salary? Why shouldn't that be an accompaniment of women's jobs as well? And I think at its most radical, a new gender politics could affirm once again that family life should be as important as employment. But this time, however, the goal should be to restore the rightful place of the domestic or the private for everyone, not just for women. I think before women can move with any legitimacy and authority in the marketplace, men must be reintegrated into the family realm. In short, our goal, I think, should be to make men's lives more like women's rather than vice versa. And lastly, I think we need to develop a critique of our society's overemphasis on paid work and its new, what I call, valorization of overwork. There's a coffee house down the street from where I live that I frequent quite a bit. And the other day I noticed a new, what I thought was a quite ominous sign. And tacked above where I buy my coffee is a sign that says, "Sleep is for the weak." And I think that should be something that a new gender politics challenges. I think that revitalizing a movement that demands not only the right to a good job, but the right to leisure and to a life apart from employment is the next frontier. Thank you.
And now, Kristine Rondeau from the Harvard Clerical, your union has a long name, Harvard Clerical Workers Union.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kris Rondeau. I'm a union organizer. Can you hear me? I like Sue Cobble. You know, I went into this line of work for very, very particular and strong reasons, and one of the primary reasons, basic point of my existence, was to try to surround myself all the time with people that I respected and admired and saw courage and bravery and humor in. And this protects me from despair. And she's one of those kind of people that it makes me happy to know she's out there. And it makes me feel comfortable. Good. Anyway, let me tell you some stories about some workers in two different workplaces. Before you were born, before we were all born, women workers were writing their labor history. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers and a new union out in Worcester, Mass. The Harvard Union actually is an historical accident. We started out as a small group of people with absolutely nothing better to do. We knew nothing about organizing. We were just a bunch of women workers at Harvard Medical School who felt invisible. So it all got started this way. The 60s were over. The 70s women's movement was on, and the women at Harvard were figuring out where we fit into the scheme of things. So a group formed in the Harvard medical area of women in labs and offices. These women had been hired in the late 60s and the early 70s when Harvard still advertised their employment as a way to find a wonderful husband with great earning potential. Anyway, this marriage ploy didn't really work. In fact, I never met a Harvard worker who married a medical student. But it is possible that if this path to the American dream had occurred more often, there never would have been a union at Harvard. Maybe self-help would not have occurred to us. But self-help did begin. And a small group of workers went to visit the dean of the medical school to talk about the wages of the women at Harvard. Can you imagine a group of miners going to the mine operators to have a polite discussion about wages? Maybe we were a bit innocent. If there was a problem, of course, they would want to fix it. Well, anyway, our representatives went, and the dean listened, and then he looked at us and he said, girls, do what men do in your position and form a union. And when you are a legally recognized bona fide labor organization, come back and we'll talk. That was in 1973. So actually, it was the dean's idea to form a union. And so we looked at each other and we said, hey, what a great idea. Let's form a union. And you may be thinking that we really were a bunch of people with nothing better to do, and you would be right. And we were typical Americans. We thought that fixing our problems would be easy. We didn't know we had a big idea. We thought we just had a normal idea. We realized how big an idea it was when we lost our first election in 1977. And we lost the second one, too, in 1981. We did get 46 and 47% of the vote. We saw something that most Americans never see: the full-blown wrath of a frightened, angry, and rich employer. Harvard management conducted full-force anti-union campaigns. What were these anti-union campaigns like? They were hell on earth. Harvard pulled out all the stops. Millions of dollars were spent on union busters, thinly disguised as lawyers. Workers got letters from various officials at Harvard, sometimes 4 in a day. They attended required captive audience meetings to be told about the evils of unions, and supervisors had one-on-one meetings with each employee where each supervisor played upon the worker's Achilles heel, her individual weakness, the fear of disruption of her stable world. The required captive audience meetings increased in ferocity as it got closer to the elections. The message was this: you will lose. We will crush you. We will cause you misery if you dare to oppose us. An anti-union campaign is a powerful Class 5 hurricane aimed at the confidence, the hopefulness, and the heart of each employee. It is especially effective against the powerless. We held each other tight while this 3-month hurricane blew away the bravery and hope of just enough of us to lose our majority. We woke up the morning after the election and we had lost. All our work had come to nothing. We were heartbroken. But some things about us hadn't changed. We still didn't have anything to do. And a few weeks and a few bottles of Jack Daniels later, one of us made a button that said, "Too dumb to quit." And we recognized that although we were deeply pro-union, that we had changed in this process also. And we had become more deeply attached to the idea that what had happened to the souls of Harvard workers during the anti-union campaigns would never happen again. An anti-union campaign plays to a core emotion for which humans are hardwired: self-doubt. The organizers of the Harvard Union decided to try to create an organization made up of individuals immune to attacks on their good humor, their friendships, and their self-confidence. We set out to invent a union that could beat an anti-union campaign. And along the way, we learned 3 things. First, we learned that all people grow and change in relationships, adults as well as children. The idea was quite contrary to conventional wisdom of organizing. When I first left my job as a technician at the Harvard Medical School to work for the union, I was told by union leaders how to organize Jane Doe. You go in, you identify the third that are for the union, you ignore the third who are opposed to the union, and you organize the middle group who are undecided. Now, there are a couple of problems with this approach. First of all, most Americans absorb fear or contempt of unions from the air they breathe, beginning at an early age. In the 1980s and 90s, almost all workers, practically 100%, start out anti-union. Furthermore, this assumes that the only people who can change are the undecided, and it completely ignores a whole third of the workforce. One day, my friends and I made 2 lists, a list of our advantages and a list of theirs. Harvard had almost all the cards: unlimited resources, unlimited managerial staff to work on the anti-union campaign. They had history and tradition, and they had power over every single one of our potential members. And we only had one thing on our list: the ability to form equal relationships based on trust with each other. Relationships are everything in organizing. The union's job is to build a relationship with every single worker. These relationships create safety and make personal change possible. In them, people become pro-union. Ideas alone don't organize people, but a good idea explored with a trusted friend does. And in these relationships, budding union leaders can take risks and learn new skills. Relationships sustain people during the dark days of the anti-union campaign. A union becomes a web of interconnected relationships and a safe haven for workers. What else did we learn? We learned that what we knew about how people make choices didn't apply one iota to union elections. American electoral politics provide very poor models for unions. Organizing a union isn't about advertising or marketing an idea. We learned that you can't approach a union election as if you're trying to convince people to buy a toaster oven, or as if you're convincing them of who to vote for governor. In a political election, about 20% of the electorate vote. In a union election, over 90% will cast a ballot. In a political election, voters are objects to be influenced, but in a union election, they're participants. The decision to vote for the union requires a strength of commitment that comes not from individuals alone, but from a community supporting an idea and each other at the same time. Union organizing means consciously building community. A union is a consciously built community in which people are connected to each other through personal relationships. Relationships that are formed talking about everyday life, kids, schools, chocolate cake recipes, Mark McGuire's home run record. We don't use literature to do this. We just listen and talk. It's painstaking work creating community, especially at the beginning. But as more people are woven into it, the feel of the workplace changes. And then organizing takes off because workers move toward that community feeling. The workplace is one of the few regular social environments left in a society where most communities are in disintegration. And Americans are yearning for community and connection and happy to find any group working on creating those ties. The third and most important thing we learned at Harvard blew another piece of conventional organizing wisdom out of the water. That is the accepted belief that workers form unions as a reaction to oppression. This idea has myth status in the United States. The theory says that the more miserable someone is at work, the more likely she will want a union. You have been raised to believe this, and you probably do believe it, and many labor leaders believe it, and virtually all of management believes it. In 20 years, I have had a consistently different experience. A worker who becomes pro-union and may be active is usually somebody who feels safe in her job. Most often, she has a good relationship with her supervisor. She holds her head up because she can do that without getting it knocked off. The truly oppressed worker is sitting at her desk with her head down. She is over-supervised. She is often poor, but she is not stupid. She has her head down for a reason. If she loses her job, she's lost just about everything. This worker does become pro-union as safety is created. The more safe it is to be pro-union, the more likely the oppressed worker will join, nearer to the end of the union drive, not at the beginning. The first people who took leadership in the Harvard Union felt safe in their jobs. They had freedom and some autonomy. They could imagine having a voice in the workplace. So we learned a lot. On May 17, 1988, our beautiful organization did its job. The sprawling Harvard University campus is made up of over 400 buildings, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, students decorated all of it with balloons and posters. And at 8 a.m., the polls opened and the workers walked to the polls. Every worker had a buddy, or in some cases, whole gangs to go with. From a plane, you could have seen clusters of workers streaming to the polls. About 15% were men, service sector men. Most were women. They were women who had raised their kids and entered the workplace late. They were Harvard secretaries who started work right out of high school and stayed there for decades. They were mothers and daughters, and they took each other by the hand, cast aside their fears, and cast their votes. The safe haven was working, creating a union for Harvard workers. That night, we went to Sanders Theater at Memorial Hall to watch the votes get counted. I walked into the theater to find about 800 workers already gathered. I looked around, seeing the front section all filled with union activists, but what I didn't expect to see was the back of the hall, filled with hundreds of the quiet ones, tightly holding hands, deeply hoping. Just after 10 o'clock, the labor board agent announced the vote count. And then I heard the loudest noise I ever heard. The anti-union campaign was beaten, and we had won our union. Lane Kirkland, you know who he is? Former president of the AFL-CIO, but not the most quoted labor leader in American history, had something that he said about such moments. He said, in the labor movement, we have tried both winning and losing, and winning is better. And so we turned into winners. Then a couple of funny things happened on the way to negotiating table. First of all, our group found ourselves on planes headed toward distant organizing drives around the country. While we negotiated with Harvard, we also traveled around the country helping other people win union elections. And over 10,000 workers were organized in universities and healthcare with our team's help and know-how. The other kind of funny thing was getting to see the inside of Harvard management. Not funny, ha-ha, exactly. We had never seen Harvard's insides before. Studying management practices and culture was new to us. Except for that one now famous conversation with the dean of the medical school, we had had no contact with power. Mass Hall is one of the places where power resides at Harvard, and it was a black box to us. We tried for years to figure out the context of every decision that management made. And like workers everywhere, we ascribed great meaning to all management decisions. We viewed these decisions as strategic, well thought out with specific intent, and we believed that the secondary effects of these decisions were fully understood. One day in 1989, John Dunlop, who was the 75-year-old chief negotiator for the management team, and I were having our daily lunch in the Worst House restaurant in Harvard Square. And that's when I explained to him that I had learned strategic thinking by watching Harvard. I had learned to think through decisions, considering their potential outcomes in 2 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, even 50 years from now, I said. I thought everything through in this way. John gasped, inhaled, he coughed, and his sandwich went everywhere. And after we cleaned off each other, he said to me, "Toots, you have a lot to learn about big institutions." And it took me a while to figure out what he meant. It had never occurred to me that there was no strategy. It was 13 years after I started at Harvard that I began to study management practices and culture. I saw that the culture of the workplace is continually pressured to imitate the market. That is, in this market culture, the self-interest of the worker and the self-interest of the employer are a perfect trade. The transaction is simple, not complex. Leave your problems, your other responsibilities, your story at the door. Welcome to the compartmentalized world of market man. Your employment relationship here is short-term, and if you're smart, you'll make contingency plans. Market man is a term invented by Harvard professor Brendan Marr. Brendan says that the morality of the market that used to apply mainly to the trading of goods is now contaminating the realm of human interaction. Market man is amoral. Market man believes that pursuing self-interest is enough. Market man views workers as an unwelcome necessity. The workplace is run as if human workers were disappointing substitutes for robots. The best worker does what she's told without injecting her ideas or her personality into the job. When market man runs the workplace, rules are uniform and rigid. Fairness is defined as doing the exact same thing for and to everyone, regardless of need or unique circumstances. An adversarial legal process is used to deal with problems. The boss wins or loses, the worker loses or wins. From the top of a workplace organization in market culture, workers are viewed as one big budget item. Once I was negotiating about health benefits for part-time workers with a very high-level Harvard administrator, and he said this gem. To me, that's the rest of my speech, workers are tuna fish. I only need to know the price of the tuna. Just think, when the competition is tough, he's just laying off tuna. So what's a good union to do? Well, we could decide to focus just on the bread and butter issues of salary and benefits. Work can continue to be compartmentalized, emotionally unrewarding, alienating, and sometimes humiliating, as long as workers can afford a decent life for their families. But I don't think so. If the union accepts the workplace market culture, it's very hard to cultivate union values there. such as community building. And a union built on the boss's culture allows many workers' needs and aspirations to go unmet. The strategies that we had used at Harvard to beat an anti-union campaign had begun to change the culture of the Harvard workplace. We asked ourselves, what more could we do? And what we decided is that in our next union drive, we had to change the workplace culture first. We would begin by loosening the grip of the market culture, by weaving in an alternative morality, and then we would build the union. Our next drive took us to a medium-sized city in central Massachusetts. You may have heard of it. For some of our team who went to Worcester, to the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, it was their first time in Worcester. What we found there were 2,300 non-union university and hospital workers mired in a market culture. In healthcare today, the transition to market culture is rapid. It's trickled down and sometimes flooded the shop floor. The UMass Medical Center had grown fast. The hospital was struggling to stay competitive in a contracting industry. Workers throughout the system felt the squeeze of expanding services coupled with constant cost cutting. And supervisors felt the strain too. They had never been well trained, and now they had to squeeze more productivity out of fewer people. Workers needed a way to influence what was going on, but they had no voice. So we set out to change the culture. We weren't completely naive. We knew that you can't change a culture by decree, and a brochure won't do it, or a beautiful policy on civility. The 2,300 workers of UMass Medical Center were angry. They had collectively had two bad experiences. First, their work lives had been changed as the hospital speeded up, doing more with less under managed care. And secondly, there had been a union drive in their recent history. 4 unions descended on the medical center, leafleting screeds against the employer and each other. Workers were customers, the unions were selling themselves, and the employer was trying to upset the transaction. The unions all lost, and everybody became more cynical. Then we pulled into town. We couldn't get inside the medical center, of course, so one by one, workers introduced us to their coworkers. Practically everyone we met in those first years was stressed and angry. And because of their experience in the previous union election, they were all anti-union. And so here's what we did. We listened. We did not try to convince them that a union was a good idea. We just listened a lot. We listened to problems, complaints, jokes, recipes, fears, ideas, and life stories. Listening to 1,000, 1,500, until finally we had met and started ongoing conversations with all 2,300, sharing stories, theirs and ours. The union sent a powerful message by listening. Simply put, listening tells someone, you are worth listening to, and your experience is important. We watched as thousands of conversations developed into thousands of relationships and friendships. We also noticed that the personality of the workplace as a whole was changing. It was the kind of thing that happened so gradually that we didn't notice it for a long time. And then when we did notice it, we saw signs of it everywhere. We saw how listening had changed the workplace. Being listened to teaches people how to listen. It probably goes without saying that people who are not listened to don't know how to listen to others. Listening teaches us to hear many voices. What we hear from others teaches us that egocentric views of the world are inaccurate, that one experience cannot be extrapolated to the whole. Listening allows individuals to develop an overview and to see themselves in a larger context. We saw the cynicism begin to fade, and optimism crept in around the edges. Old-fashioned caring and solidarity became possible again. And the process of listening to so many life stories changed us, too. The organizers' lives and the workers' lives became intertwined, and we woke up one morning to the stark realization of how much we cared. the idea of losing a union election was not an option. So we began to organize our union. That part was pretty easy. We had relationships, each person had a trusted friend, and now we could have solid informational conversations about the union's values and what a union can be. We didn't ever try to make workers mad. Of course it's right to be angry about insults and injustice, but anger is a very weak foundation for an organization, not to mention that it makes it a very unpleasant organization to be in. Anger can't sustain a union over a long haul. Besides, a campaign that told happy workers to be unhappy or told angry workers to be happy would surely fail. Unconventional as ever, we didn't organize against the boss or around workplace issues. Issues come and go, and it's too easy to argue for a union because you hate the boss. American workers see good and bad in their employers. Ultimately, they want good, productive relationships with the employer, and that is not a likely outcome of a negative campaign. To change the culture, you can't reinforce negative values in the workplace. There was no simple message. There was no soundbite, no slogan, no simple way of analyzing the employer or the union. The message was complex. Instead of choosing sides, each worker needed to come to an understanding of the union that resonated with his or her own experience. We talked with everyone, and we worked especially hard to maintain good relationships with people who disagreed with us. That prevented the workplace from getting polarized into camps of yes and no votes. So we organized our union around the idea of good faith, deep participation. The idea that self-respecting adults should represent themselves in all matters. And the belief that the workplace functions better and is more productive when workers participate in decision-making. Organizing around participation moves the culture away from simple, crude market values because it encourages active engagement, thoughtfulness, and an analysis of the system from many angles. It discourages the detached attitude of, I'm just going to do this one little task over and over, keep my head down, and collect my paycheck. Before we began building the union at UMass, we really did change the culture first. An incredibly cynical group of people dared to hope. Workers became pro-union, and many came to understand that there is no blueprint or map to follow, no legal document to sign, no insurance policy to buy. The union is a living, organic thing that is continuously shaped by what we all bring to it. Of course, such an idea would be scary without some unifying force. For us, that unifying force is kindness. Our union's values are simple, frequently stated and lived by. We treat each other and all others, including management, with kindness. We had a stunning victory at the UMass election. When the votes were counted on September 11th, 1997, 63% had voted for the union. We weren't surprised to win. At this point, our team had experienced 5 big union victories since Harvard, but we were surprised by the margin. And the next day, we were all still friends, no matter how each person voted. Ultimately, it's the union's role to change the culture of the workplace, to put it right. It's not enough to get rid of market morality in the workplace. We need to replace it with something better. The consciously created community is an alternative morality. The alternative morality is pretty simple. It's the safe haven at work. Over time, the culture of the workplace must move from an attitude of complacency to one of engagement, from adversarialism to problem solving, from mutual mistrust to mutual support, and most importantly for workers, from fear to hope. We're negotiating with UMass Medical Center now. We hope that management will choose to go with us down this path. We believe deep engagement with a good union helps the employer meet its goals of excellence and productivity. Workers have a lot to offer. 2 heads really are better than one. Workers want meaningful work, They want to help run the enterprise. But whether the employer sees the light or not, unions have to combat market morality and create an alternative for their members. The task for unions as we hit the year 2000 is not normal-sized. Unions must be community builders among their own members, with management, and then in the community outside the workplace. We must move from a simplistic view of the world as us versus them to a sophisticated view of productive engagement where the amorality of the market is humanized by community values. It's a big job, but I think we must do it. Thank you.